Hi there, my name is Graeme Codrington from the TomorrowToday Global team. We've been tracking COVID throughout 2020 and helping our clients to anticipate what would happen and prepare for it in advance. And here's our review of 2020. We're going to do this in 5 questions, and the first question in this video is, how did we do? And I suppose to answer that question we have to ask, well, compared to what? Compared to our worst case fears, we've done exceptionally well. March, April this year, people were saying that there was the potential of millions of people dying across the world, and especially biggest fears of all for Africa, who have lots of underlying health issues from TB to malaria and HIV/AIDS, and that hasn't happened. And so our worst case scenarios have maybe not been fulfilled. So that's some good news, but maybe that's not the best way to ask, how did we do? So I've got 3 pieces of good news, 2 pieces of bad news, and maybe helpfully that will help us sum it up. So the first piece of good news is that we did do better than we thought, because we worked out really quickly what we needed to do. The good news is that the disease can be met with physical distancing, wearing masks, and just washing your hands for 20 seconds or more. 2 happy birthdays, we were told. We discovered that various forms of tracking and tracing worked, and maybe that's one of the things we learned the most. The countries that have dealt with this most effectively, the likes of New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, have all done massive track and tracing options. They're differently done in different countries. Those are we've seen different ways to do this, but basically if you track down, and if you're able to track down every single person who's got COVID or who has had contact with COVID and then isolate them for 14 days, you stop the virus in its tracks. Does mean you have to shut down borders, and so even though that might not be technically lockdown, there is some level of lockdown available. We've learned which options of lockdown have been most successful, and what we need to do as countries, as communities, and as individuals to deal with COVID. So there's some good news there. The bad news is that a lot of countries have not done that. It's quite variable what's happened around the world. And those countries that have not locked down sufficiently, or who have denied, or who have had arguments about the science behind the vaccines, those countries have done worse. I'm thinking of countries like, famously in Europe, Belarus, like Brazil, like most of the United States, or at least, maybe this is an unfair generalization, but most of the Republican-led states. And those countries have seen massive spikes in not just infections, but in deaths as well. Famously, Sweden tried to go the herd immunity route, and it's not really a great country to look at for everybody else, because in Swedish culture, you don't have to have government regulations. The government can provide advice and people will take the advice. Also, Sweden doesn't have massive urban clusters of people. It's a very spread out country. Also, just by nature, they don't connect and engage physically. There's no hugging and greeting when they're kissing and so on. So it probably was the best country in the world to give no lockdown a go, except that hasn't worked for them either. Their economy has been just as hit as anybody else's in their neighborhood, and they have more mortality and more infections than any of their neighbors. And yes, we might say, well, let's look again in 2 or 3 years' time, because all they've done is speeded up the herd immunity of their country. But actually it doesn't appear that way. In random tests across the country, it looks as if they've got just about as much people with antibodies as Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Estonia. So probably too early to make massive pronouncements on these things, but we can see the difference between countries that have taken the virus seriously and then made decisions accordingly, and those that have argued about it and haven't taken it seriously. And I think we know who did better. Second piece of good news then is that the medical fraternity of the world has done a magnificent job of reducing mortality. Remember in early days with Italy and Spain and parts of the UK just being overwhelmed with infections and hospitals, even New York, Ecuador, another country where you literally had bodies piling up outside hospitals and hospitals overwhelmed and full. Mortality at that stage was running between 15 and 20% of anybody who got COVID. 15 to 20% of people were dying. And that's partly because the system was overwhelmed, partly because we didn't quite know how to treat it. I think we made some mistakes early on. And those countries that decided to lock down fast and early, those countries, some of that lockdown wasn't to do with the fact that they actually had the disease already. It was to prepare, to, remember the phrase, flatten the curve, to make sure that we didn't get overwhelmed, to give us time to work out what this disease was, to give time for science to kind of catch up. And I think that was successful. And that, by the way, is I think part of the reason why African countries have not been hard hit, because they didn't have COVID cases, those that did lock down, especially in southern Africa. They locked down early without having a lot of internal transmission already, and that gave time. I saw a report in South Africa from one of the big medical companies, Discovery Health, who said that South Africa, by going into early lockdown, and quite a strict lockdown, gave ourselves 75 days more than we would have had to prepare ourselves, buy PEE, build ventilators, and especially learn about the disease. So right now, mortality is below 1%, which is remarkable how much we've learned and how open source that learning has been as it's spread around the world. Now that brings me to my second piece of bad news, and that is that the virus continues to mutate. We knew that it would, and there are now some more virulent strains around. But also we've now discovered that although we've reduced the death rate, we still think we'll keep that below 1%. About 20% of people get something we're calling long COVID now. And that means that they get a tough and rough version of COVID. My own sister had this version, and she said it's the worst thing she's ever had. And that's what you're hearing from people who have, she didn't even get in, didn't need to be hospitalized. The people who have been hospitalized and survived just say it's the nastiest thing they've ever had. And others with this long COVID just say it's horrible. And here's the problem: they are not recovering fully. They're recovering very, very slowly. And people 6, 7, 8 months later have still not fully recovered. And some, because this is a vascular disease, this is not a respiratory disease as we initially thought. It comes in via the lungs, but this gets into your blood and then travels across your whole body. And this is not medical terminology, but it basically chooses an organ to hit in your body. And some people get their brain hit. Some people have had their heart, their liver. Heard of a young guy who got his pancreas hit. He's 17 years old and he's now diabetic, literally overnight diabetic, because COVID got into his pancreas. And the doctors are telling us that this long COVID could have lifelong medical impacts. And that could be a disaster. We need to stop talking about the mortality rate only, and people say, well, only less than 1% of people die, so just let it run through the population. Well, are you happy for 20% of the population to have lifelong medical responses just because you don't want to physical distance or wear a mask or sanitize properly? So, I think we learned a lot about this disease, and we learned some good stuff about reducing mortality, but we learned that it's a rougher, tougher disease than we could have imagined. Which brings me to my final piece of good news, and that is we have vaccines. This is unbelievable. The previous record for building a vaccine was 4 years for the mumps vaccine. And we have a vaccine now within a year. The vaccine that has been produced, the first vaccines rolling out, Pfizer, Moderna, on these mRNA models, were actually developed in March, by the way, because of the work of Chinese scientists who sequenced the COVID genome in January and released that public open source to the world. And on the basis of that research, people who had already been doing work on vaccines related to SARS and MERS, remember, from decades ago, and had worked on this thing called an mRNA vaccine, which is a different approach to vaccines. They'd been working on it, and then they could take this genetic sequencing, put it into their vaccine. They then trialed it and got it to human trials, which were then able to be given emergency approval. So I say all of that because these vaccines haven't been fast-tracked. These vaccines haven't just appeared from nowhere. They're not experimental vaccines that we're hoping will work. We've been working on them for years, in fact decades, and now we can just plug. This is the beautiful thing about these vaccines. It's a new style of vaccine where you just plug the DNA, the genetic information from the virus into this vaccine, and it can literally work overnight. What a remarkable feat of science, and that we can now experience it within 12 months of identifying this global pandemic virus. We now have the vaccine to respond to it. Of course, though, vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. And we've now got to convince a whole lot of people to take the vaccine, and we've got to produce and distribute enough to get 70 or 80% of the world's population to take it. And that leads to the final point, which is the lessons for 2021. You see, even with a vaccine in the system, it's going to take most of 2021 to get the vaccine out there, probably well into 2022, before we feel the full effects of a vaccine. If one country is vaccinated but the countries around it are not vaccinated, international travel is still going to be massively disrupted. International supply chains still going to be massively disrupted. And if one country does a good job but the country next to it does a bad job, this is going to be problematic. So we need to still expect more disruption. We have still got a lot to learn about this virus, and we still have a lot to do in terms of making sure that vaccines are spread around the world, made affordable, are able to be distributed, and that we get people confident to take the vaccine so that we can beat COVID. Until then, keep physical distancing, keep wearing your mask, keep sanitizing, stop fighting science, and let's fight this thing together. On a combined front. We don't want more lockdowns, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. This is Tomorrow Today's review of 2020 with me, Graeme Codrington. How did we do? We did better than we thought we would. I think we did better than we expected. We did much better than our worst case scenario, and we've learnt a lot. In other words, I think it was the worst of years, but it was a good year too, if we learn those lessons and take them forward into 2021. Let's do that.